and then the company was sold to a national or an international company for a great profit. So it took my courage and willingness to confront authority in a firm but loving way to basically save that company. So when confronting authority, it's important not to do it in a confronting authority is not really the right term, because what I'm trying to say is that you don't necessarily deal with it in a confrontational way. You deal with it in almost a psychoanalytic way, where you try to understand where that other person's thinking is flawed and gradually lead them in a dialectical, almost Socratic discussion to realizing themselves what is wrong as opposed to telling them it's wrong. And I should mention that one of the things that has influenced my life was studying a lot of philosophy as a teenager in high school. I really didn't attend much school. I spent most of my high school days from age 13 to 18 hitchhiking around the United States with a backpack full of books and reading. And ironically, I never got a high school diploma because I was deemed to have insufficient gym credits, even though I was hiking the Appalachian Trail and bivouacking in the mountains in the winter and getting my scuba certification in Florida. So studying philosophy has been really important as well. And it's not something that I explicitly call upon. It's more that it became part and parcel of my worldview, just like thinking about animal behavior or evolutionary biology.
All right, that's super fascinating, and I guess, and this is a separate point altogether, but I guess it speaks about the education system as well, which I'm presuming hasn't changed much since you were in school. But that's a separate point altogether. So, following your stay at Yale and your work as an evolutionary biologist, you joined the National Science Foundation to help basically build out the internet, as far as I understand. Could you talk a little bit more about that experience?
Yes. So during my time at Yale, starting in 1981, I was using ARPANET and BitNet for communication with other academics and scholars around the world, and also using the few databases that were available at the time, and doing a lot of statistical consulting. So after 2 or 3 years, I became one of the few internet consultants for the entire Yale campus and started writing documentation about how to use Usenet and listserv and FTP and Telnet and all these other things, and was just very, very fluent in that. And so, putatively, I was studying biology, but I was simultaneously getting a technical education, and that's another life lesson I've learned, is that in the course of learning or getting an education or studying, it's very often the case that you can gain expertise in 2 or several things simultaneously. So even though my degree at Yale was in evolutionary biology, it was really my side work in internet technology that the most effective non-degree ended up being. So I ended up getting a job at the National Science Foundation Network in Seattle, Washington, and I was employee number 2 for NorthwestNet, which was the regional network for the internet backbone. At the time, there were 13 or 15 regional backbones for the internet in the United States. There was NorthwestNet, there was MidNet, there was, each were like responsible for a certain region in the United States. So the team that I joined was responsible for implementing the data centers and the transmission lines for the internet backbone from Alaska to Oregon to Colorado. So these people were, running network operations centers and developing protocols for the internet backbone, and they were also creating educational materials. So one of my gigs was to write documentation on how to use supercomputers, how academics could use supercomputers. And at the time, there were maybe 9 supercomputer centers around the United States, at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications in Champaign-Urbana, and in San Diego, SDSC, I think it was called, San Diego Supercomputer Center, and so forth. So I wrote documentation on how to use supercomputers and parallelization on Crays and other machines, as well as other kinds of use cases of the internet, which led me to writing books about how to use everything on the internet. And I ended up writing 4 books on how to use the internet from 1990 to 1995. And I helped recruit unknown tens or hundreds of thousands of people to start using the internet even before the World Wide Web, which was a great honor. And I also was involved in creating curricula for how to use the internet for K through 12 education. As somebody who had been very dissatisfied with my experience in American K through 12 education, I saw many advantages to using the internet in the K through 12 educational system. So I also wrote a manual for educators around the United States on how to use the internet, databases and pedagogical materials and everything. And that is sort of a nice prelude to some of the work I'm doing at RChain currently, which we can talk about in the next episode, where I'm helping to identify people to develop curricula to learn how to work within the RChain platform and code in our new language, Rolang. I also mentioned parallelization from my supercomputer usage documentation, and another really strong feature of Rolang is concurrency, which is an even stronger version or a step beyond parallelization. Back in the early 90s, parallelization was all that was achievable, but now we can do concurrency thanks to the breakthroughs of PyCalculus and the row calculus that are RChain's founder, Greg Meredith. So again, there's these recurring themes that pop up. When I was doing work on parallelization in the 90s, I never realized, conceptually, this is something that's going to be useful 28 years later. So again, all these different things that one can learn in life kind of can pop up as recurring themes and be useful skills and experiences to call on later. I kind of rambled there a little bit, but I think that answered your question.
No, absolutely not at all. I mean, I think that's interesting, and yes, I've followed Greg for a while, and I've seen a lot of his other interviews, and I know he talks a lot about concurrency and some of the other models of computation, and so we'll definitely get into those in the next episode. So, I mean, I'm just curious. You mentioned the manual that you wrote. From all the way from 1990 to 1995. So I was born in 1992. I started using the internet kind of, towards like 97 onwards. So I'm just curious how the internet was like and what was in the guide actually. I wonder what would go into a manual to use the internet when you did write it.
So at the time, the way one interacted with the internet, let's say 1989, most of the interaction with the internet was command line sort of things. So one would manually type a telnet and then a numeric internet address. And then one would have some sort of command line interface to a database or some sort of I don't even remember anymore, but it was very much a command line